are at item 18, which is the James Madison Park Master Plan discussion and possible recommendation. That's what a lot of people are here for, I understand. I think it's important to keep to the 3-minute limit that we did last month. And there's been a request to have aggregated speakers. That's not what we've done here in the past. I don't think it's appropriate to do without giving people notice that that's an option. So we are going to have people speak one at a time. There are enough people here that I would like to call out these in order. I'll call one, and then I will let the next person know that they're up next. I neglected to do this consistently the last time, so someone will undoubtedly remind me that I neglected it this time also. The alder here may also want to speak before or after. What is your, are you interested?
I would like to hear what people have to say. I would like to also hear the presentation by staff and consultants.
Well, let's start with the presentation by our staff. Welcome, Sarah.
Can you hear me? All right, hello again. So my name is Sarah Lerner. I'm a landscape architect with the City of Madison Parks Division, and I'm here to follow up on last month's meeting regarding the James Madison Park Master Plan. Today we are here to present 2 parking alternatives to the option that we presented in December. So first, I just want to take a brief moment to go over a bit of background information since not everyone was at the last meeting. This project is the result of public interest expressed during the 2013 Park Shelter study to create a more comprehensive vision for the park. In 2017, as part of a citywide initiative to promote equity and inclusion, the city used the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative tool to guide development of an RFP for this master plan. This tool was designed to promote inclusiveness of underrepresented populations in public decision-making. It was one of the city's first projects to use the tool proactively prior to starting planning and design. The RESG process came up with recommendations to guide the public input process that were presented at last month's meeting and were mailed to you. The public engagement process focused on getting input from a broad range of park users and working towards making sure people who are historically underrepresented at public meetings had the opportunity to provide input. This engagement strategy included a variety of mechanisms, including sending individual letters and posters to over 100 community organizations, holding 4 public meetings and 5 stakeholder meetings, and having 6 focus group discussions as recommended by the tool with groups such as Access to Independence, a disability resource, an advocacy group, as well as members of the YWCA 3rd Street, which is living for expectant or single mothers. We combined and categorized over 1,000 comments that were received in this process, and for several months the design team reviewed a public engagement and analyzed the existing conditions, reviewing how the proposed plan could respond to this public input. What we learned is what people wanted: to improve the park shelter, attractiveness, and amenities, to increase basic park amenities, to improve shoreline access and interaction, increase the amount and types of play spaces, improve the lake and beach cleanliness, maximize spaces and improve paths, improve park safety, improve universal accessibility, improve and expand native landscaping, and improve the basketball court amenities. This preliminary research guided 3 schematic plans addressing the top desired improvements. The schematic plans were presented at public meeting 3, and after this meeting, the plans were revised based on feedback from that meeting, presented at public meeting 4, and then they were slightly revised again and presented at the Board of Park Commissioners meeting last month. So this is the plan that was presented to you at the December 12th Board of Park Commissioners meeting. It includes the new park shelter and the general location of the existing park shelter, an open lawn area, increased bioinfiltration for stormwater management, increased native habitat, improved ADA access, 2 basketball courts, a volleyball court, a play area, and several overlooks for fishing access. It also relocates the existing 34 parking spaces, creating a parking lot visible from East Gorham. The parking lot was reconfigured on several principles that include provide access to both park shelters and Mendota rowing, providing parking to serve multiple park amenities centrally, such as the basketball court, beach, and playground, and providing parking that was accessible and inclusive to activities within the park, and to relocate the parking to provide better management of stormwater runoff. Additionally, throughout the process, we heard and continue to hear that people have feelings and concerns about safety with the parking lot. The last public meeting was in September, but we also received emails afterwards regarding the parking lot, mainly expressing concerns about the green space, the removal of trees, and concerns about views. On January 2nd, we also attended a meeting held by a stakeholder to identify criteria and strategies for providing parking at the park. So I want to let you know that staff has and continues to evaluate on-street parking options, and we are looking at off-street parking options on Butler, East Gorham, and Blount Street. So based on the input that we received from BPC, from you guys, we have developed 2 alternate parking options, which I wanted to present. So staff and the design team developed 2 options that focus on view preservation, minimizing tree removals, and preserving green space. All options, including what was presented last month, have the same number of parking spaces that are currently at James Madison Park. Both of these new options remove the parking between Gates of Heaven and Franklin Street, providing several hundred feet of uninterrupted green space. Both of the options you're going to see reconfigure the Gates of Heaven parking lot to include a drop-off and a loading zone for the facility and handicap spaces adjacent to the building. This improves sight lines into the parking lot and provides a turnaround so that people don't have to back into East Gorham if the lot is full. Both options realign the far eastern path to preserve an existing oak tree and reduce the tree conflicts from the plan that you saw last week from 16 down to 12. So here's a close-up view of the changes of option 1 and how this configuration reconfigures the existing 34 spaces. So by removing the parking area between Franklin and Gates of Heaven, we retain the existing views along about over 300 feet, I would say, of East Gorham Street. In this configuration, it provides 12 spots for Gates of Heaven, and then it also provides 14 spots for the central active area for the canoe and kayak launch, docks, beach, basketball courts, shelter, playground, and volleyball court. This configuration keeps the existing 8 spots that are currently at North Blount Street, but provides a turnaround so that people don't have to back into East Gorham if that lot is full. This is parking option 2. So this plan reconfigures the existing parking spaces further by reducing the number of off-street parking spaces off of East Gorham. To do this, here's a close-up of that area as well. We have incorporated 14 spaces at Gates of Heaven, and then it reduces the number of parking spaces on the East Gorham lot from 14 down to 8 stalls between Blair and Franklin in order to open up the views adjacent to the shelter and at the end of Blair Street. But this configuration would require additional spaces at the end of Blount Street to keep the same number of stalls that currently exist. So, as I mentioned at last month's presentation, park master plans, especially for community parks that are intended to serve the entire city, involve a complexity of considerations, and they often require addressing opposing views and competing interests. With this plan, we worked on engaging historically different types of public methods and people who are not always heard in the public input process. And we hope that these revised options retain the priorities we heard from this broad range of people but also respect the new concerns that we've heard about parking along East Gorham. These options are meant to facilitate a discussion on the topic by showing how this parking could be reconfigured, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. With me is the design team, Psyche Design, as well as Urban Assets, who were involved in the public engagement.
Sarah, thank you. Let's then hear from the public. Mr. Cohen, Mike Cohen of 2667 Milwaukee Street, wishes to speak.
It's Canaan, but thank you.
Thank you. I apologize.
It's all right. Nobody gets it right.
Oh, I beg your pardon. All right. James Ty, from Clean Lakes Alliance. Thank you.
I'm a longtime shore fisherman and a lifelong Madison resident. I spend more time fishing from James Madison Park seawall than any other place in the city. This is a very special place on Lake Mendota. The action of the waves crashing against the seawall keep the bottom clean. This provides important walleye and game fish habitat. If the seawall was removed, the shoreline would silt into a gradual taper similar to the beach. This would cover the offshore rock structure that draws game fish and minnows to the spot. The seawall is in relatively good shape, and I don't believe the city should spend money demolishing it in any redesign of the park. As for people who don't feel secure walking there, they need to realize it's only 2-3 feet deep, depending on the lake level. It's not a real hazard. People walk by and they see dark water and they don't know what's there. It's not that deep. I realize I'm kind of an invisible park user because I generally fish at night. I have been fishing here for over 40 years. Like I said, it's a very special spot for someone who doesn't own a boat. If it were to be rip-wrapped, it would become exactly the same as the unkept mess behind Lincoln School. It's full of invasive weeds and junk tree saplings. This is not safe to walk on, effectively ending my access. If the talked about fishing access piers were installed, I'm afraid they will destroy what is special about this spot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. James Ty and then David Sappho. Mr. Ty, welcome.
Thank you. My name is James Ty. I'm the Executive Director at the Clean Lakes Alliance, representing over 2,000 individual donors throughout the greater Madison area. I'm going to speak today specifically on items that will affect water quality and quantity regarding the park, and have been very supportive and glad to see the work that the city park staff has done to do outreach to various communities. Number one, the Clean Lakes Alliance would like to see a total reduction in hard services in the park. I think that is being accomplished, but would like to know specifics of how much hard services are being reduced, and then any hard services we should be looking at, can they be permeable? There are a lot of things in this. I've talked about taking permeable and make it, from permeable to impermeable, or the other way around, excuse me. Number two, the shoreline should be improved. There is statistical data from the DNR that I can forward to you that we have hardscaped too much of our shoreline, not providing the natural shoreline, which is actually better for habitat, and we've actually lost species natural to the lake. There's a report from the DNR because of the feeding habits of different fish. We don't have a lot of areas for minnows and things like that. So looking at the shoreline, we are excited that there are multiple ways along the shoreline that's being used, from everything from a naturalization area to a beach to a fishing piers, because right now the shoreline could be improved. And most importantly is the stormwater runoff. We have over 600 stormwater outfalls that go into the entire chain of lakes. There's a great opportunity to show the community that the city of Madison wants to improve water quality through the interpretive wetland. There's a large outfall that takes basically most of the stuff around the Capitol Square and puts it directly into the lake. That means everything that happens on the Capitol Square or outside the bar or outside student housing or anything like that ends up in the lake. And so this interpretive wetland that's going to be engineered, it's going to be very important for people to see that the parks and the city of Madison is taking stormwater seriously, not only for actually removing some of the trash before it gets into the lake and some of the sediment, but also seeing that natural habitat will bring some of those things back to the urban corridor, such as birds and other types of habitat. We're also excited to see that we want to look at the total amount of wetlands, I mean not wetlands, but rain gardens. The Parks Department has worked aggressively at all the parking areas or all the walkways, the roof areas, making sure that the park can retain as much water and infiltrate it back into it. So I'm not here to support the park in total, but for the commission to make sure when you are approving this that you look hard at the shoreline and the stormwater.
Thank you.
I'm available for questions.
David Sappho of 944 East Mifflin, and after him would be Debbie James. Hi.
Hi, good evening. I want to thank you all for holding this meeting on this important topic. I'm a resident here in Madison, a frequent park goer. Often play basketball down on the courts at James Madison Park during the spring and summertime. And I do have some concerns with the design that has been presented. I do not think it's appropriate or necessary to move the parking lot and the basketball courts from their current location essentially to the middle of open green space. I think the concerns that folks are trying to address with this new design are well-founded. Increasing accessibility for folks is important, and obviously creating a parking lot. I understand there's some concerns about criminal activity. I think there's some other folks here who are going to speak to the fact that maybe some of the concerns over crime in the existing parking lot are overblown. I can tell you I've been going, as I said, to play basketball down there the past 2 or 3 years. Granted, I'm there during the daylight. I've never encountered any problems. And as far as accessibility is concerned, I think there are ways to accommodate folks who are disabled or handicapped, again, without putting a large concrete structure, moving the courts and the parking lot into the middle of green space. And one of the things that I think could be considered is putting designated handicap spots along East Gorham Street so that you give access to those people to these more central amenities. But I think it's important to maintain contiguous green space, and I don't think it's appropriate to relocate the lot and the basketball courts. I think the current location is perfectly adequate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out. Debbie James of 646 East Gorham, to be followed by Marion Selesnik.
Thank you again, and thank you for the additional work and effort at taking people's thoughts into consideration. I really appreciate that as a new resident here in Madison, very much. And so I very much agree with what the previous gentleman said about relocating these hard surfaces right into the middle of this beautiful, huge, open green space that we have right near downtown Madison, which is just so beautiful, right along the water. And I ask, be so bold to consider Mother Earth's thoughts about this as well. So thank you for considering it.
Marion Selesnik of 1734 Sheridan Drive, followed by Kathy Rankin.
Hi, my name is Marianne Selesnik. I agree with this previous speaker about not moving the basketball court. I have some things I'm going to say about the parking lot. I haven't totally absorbed what Sarah Lerner said, but I'm just going to go ahead with this. The parking lot is already in the perfect place. It satisfies the needs of visitors to Gates of Heaven for the many events that take place there every year. The proposed parking lot will stretch 2 blocks and will make the park look like a strip mall. Parking spaces plus an access lane will take a big slice off the existing green space. As I walked through there a couple days ago, I was struck by how narrow that band of land that makes up James Madison actually is. Now there's a view of the lake framed by the green lawn and trees. This plan drastically changes the view. I would rather look at a line of trees and grass than a line of parked cars. Those mature trees, even if not perfect, are still a huge asset. New ones could be planted to replace any that are in decline, but once you pave it over, you won't get any big shade trees. Maybe you could shoehorn in a few small ones. Preserving green space was listed as a high priority by those attending planning sessions. So how did this plan occur? Some activities in the parking lot led to this plan. Once moving the parking lot became the first priority, the rest of the park had to accommodate it. Alder Zellers cited 700 calls for service in the park in 2017. What were the nature of these calls? I checked police department incident reports for 2017, expecting a long line of incidents, and there were only 3 for 2017 and 3 for 2018. Whatever the number of police calls, only a few rose to the level of being reported as incidents. Calls for service does not necessarily mean police calls. The park rangers are responsible for many calls for service. I did learn that anytime the ranger sees the need to leave his vehicle to walk the park, it's recorded as a call for service, even though no one actually called. The park is heavily used on certain days with much activity in the open areas and shelter, so the parking lot is not the only area that needs to be monitored. And how many calls for service relate to the parking lot as opposed to the rest of the park, we don't know. And we don't know how many calls are for minor things like the hammocks not being hung with proper padding. There's a misconception that this park is extremely dangerous with 700 police calls. That is not true. So drastic changes to James Madison should not be made without fully understanding the safety issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy Rankin of 2818 Ridge Road, to be followed by Don O'Crowley of 646 East Gorham Street.
Hi, my name is Kitty Rankin, and I've worked in the Historic Preservation Plan for the city for 29 years. I hope you had a chance to read the letter my husband and I wrote to you and sent you in early December about the location of the parking. I received a response to that letter from Mr. Knepp recently and want to start by saying that the Parks Division has this, I want to say that by stating that the Parks Division has historically favored active recreation over beautiful landscapes, I did not mean to cast aspersions on the current staff. I've been retired for 10 years, so I don't know most of those people anymore. I said historically, and that's the way I meant it. I have a quote from David Clarenbach, who represented part of Madison in the state legislature for 9 terms and is also still a Madison activist, and he has authorized me to read this to you. In the fall of 1971, I was appointed by Alder Dennis McGilligan to chair a study committee to recommend expansion and improvements at James Madison Park. We conducted an extensive survey to determine what was most needed and what was not desirable for this downtown urban park and beach. Among our recommendations, which were accepted as part of the city's improvements, was relocation and expansion of the beach itself to its current site, construction of the bathhouse and restroom facility now located on the eastern end of the park, a walking path along the lake, landscaping, a court for recreational basketball, and a small detached parking lot at the far western edge of the park, as isolated as possible from the primary focus of the park. While it's been 47 years since our recommendations were submitted and implemented, I firmly believe that the last thing we need today, just as was our perspective those many years ago, is additional parking to intrude on this beautiful urban landscape." Unquote. My husband and I strongly urge you to reconsider the parking plans and keep the parking behind and on the side of the old synagogue, where it will not intrude on one of the few opportunities the general public has to enjoy the view of our largest iconic lake. Thank you.
Thank you. Donna Crowley of 646 East Gorham. And followed by Jackie Suska.
You just have a couple minutes to set up the pieces
Okay.
before you start the time.
And these are the same images, hoping you all can see them. It's upside down. We said options. Thank you.
Now, I believe you live in one of the houses.
I do, the Anna
Which
and
house is it
C.C.
that you
Collins
live in?
house. We call it the middle house.
The middle house.
646, I'm, the new proposed adjacent house would fill the void next to me,
All right.
which has been a privilege, so thank you very much for that. Thank you again. When I was here last meeting, the first question I'd asked is if you had your standards for approval before you. So again, I ask that question. Your standards require the comprehensive plan be in compliance, as well as your park and open space plan, of which many of the public comments you're hearing are in those plans. So we're here today with another iteration of which Parks has opened up the conversation to discussing more options, and this is an option we feel merits study by city staff and presentation to the public with the other options today. This option has the same quantity of parking, every program feature that's included. It preserves every tree, so it's not lost by construction. It relocates two functions. It relocates the shelter to the west near Gates of Heaven, so the Gates of Heaven can then have an accessible restroom instead of requesting a porta potty 10 days prior to having someone with accessible needs. This will avoid exceptionalism, which is a beautiful written goal in the report. This option also relocates the motor boats from the very active and successful paddle sport area and provides safety from that, which is a Madison ordinance related to distance from the paddle sports piers. This preserves all of the beautiful views into the park, the dramatic open space that so many presenters before me have spoke about. This provides accessible routes, accessible parking in several locations, and continues to have all of the wonderful active amenities in the center of the park. Every active amenity stays in the center of the park. Rentals, concessions, showers, restrooms. So we're proposing a smaller seasonal building that wouldn't need to be heated or cooled for just the summer use. The restrooms, the pumps for the beach, maybe small paddle boat vendor storage. And then with the west end of the park, being able to have a synergy with Gates, have a smaller, more efficient parking lot that allows a turnaround, allows a drop-off. Similarly, on the top of Blount Street, we propose also a parking lot, accessible parking, and a drop-off. So the smoother, softer terrain of the park can be used for the accessible routes more effectively than the relocation of a new shelter in the center of the park. The process was studying the renovation of the existing shelter until September. So many of the conversations related to the center of the park and the shelter location were related to its renovation. So the Parks Department has established that the existing shelter will be deconstructed, and we have not seen these other opportunities.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Jackie Suska of 946 State Street, followed by Joe Lucen. I hope I said that right.
Hi, thanks again for listening. I think one of the main reasons we're here tonight is because the initial plan, there was problems with the design process, and I think one of the main issues was that the comp plan and the open spaces plan, those current plans were not really followed with this design, or with the former designs, and even the ones that have been presented for the last two designs that they just worked out. There's just been a lack of vision as far as trying to protect green space, trees, access to green space, which promotes public health, sustainability, and adaptability, is also a key component of the open spaces plan. They say they want to keep flexible space in the parks. By removing so much space for parking, you're really limiting what you can do in that space. You can just park a few cars, Some of the new plans, I think it's, 12 or 14 cars in one plan, 11, or I think 8 in the other plan, and that just takes too much space away from people that really need it. I mean, this is really a small urban park, and every square foot counts, and I just feel like I feel like what many residents feel when they wrote, emailed in, and came these meetings, it's, we really have to look at this in a different way. And I think what John's plan does is it does address a lot of those issues. Gates of Heaven and the shelter would be shared by a parking lot, so all of those spaces could be in the vicinity of the two places that really need them the most. I think there could be some issues with ADA accessibility, but we don't have the answers. This plan wasn't ever vetted, so there's possible solutions there, ones that we haven't seen yet. Maybe some kind of a loading zone from Blair going into the park that's near some of those other amenities. Basically what we're requesting today is that this plan is studied. I think what we deserve is the best plan possible, and I'd really push you to ask for this plan to be studied and other options too. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe Lesson of 640 East Forum, followed by Robert Sutton of Middle East Forum. You again are one of the residents of these properties?
Correct. Yep, for the last 5 years, my wife.
Which house do you live in?
The 640, it's the smallest brick house above the Rolling Club.
Okay.
So thanks for the opportunity to speak again. I really appreciate it. And I also recognize the valuable process that's occurred over the last year. I think the 10,000 or 20,000 outreaches is admirable. That's a lot of postcards to people. A lot of people, didn't tell them that there was going to be a parking lot along Gorham. And a lot of people that we've talked to recently, families at Lapham School and other, thought this was a shelter redesign. And so they didn't, everybody wants to redesign that shelter, right, or tear it down. They didn't realize it was going to be such an overhaul of park with a parking lot along Gorham. So I think it's valuable and legitimate to take in the 100 letters and emails that you and all the resellers have gotten in the last month into consideration. Just quickly, the plan to put even the shortened road that was shown as options tonight from Blair to Franklin would still ruin some of the best public views and take away the cherished open space at the narrowest part of the park. And not only would the trees and the green space be lost, but the space between the cars and the lake. You've got a parking lot there, right? And that wonderful open space. Now, who's going to want to put down a picnic blanket in front of the cars? You lose extra space. It just becomes, it's an unfortunate result that I don't think we need to do. I think there are better alternatives that we can come a lot closer to meeting everybody's needs. And these options still take away too much parking from Gates of Heaven, that it deserves more parking. A truly viable solution that I wish the Commission and City staff would explore in good faith is this West End shelter idea. I think it should be presented at a public meeting and researched. By keeping the shelters so far away from Gates of Heaven, we end up with these parking proposals that just don't work. But having both structures share one West End parking lot solves, I think, all of our problems. It allows the ADA accessible bathroom near Gates of Heaven, which was mentioned. It saves all the endangered trees along Gorham. It maintains the ample parking that Gates needs to succeed. And most importantly, I think it preserves the rare public views of Lake Mendota for both the passing public and people arriving in Madison from the airport, anything, people biking past, walking that serene stretch that doesn't have curb cuts and where people can picnic and do everything, have parties on the open lawn. And the shelter nestled in the side of that Varex hill, if you will, doesn't block the public views of the lake either, which I think is something that we're talking about with the comprehensive plan. And the police calls, other people will speak to this, it wasn't 700 police calls, it was 42 police calls. A lot of those 700 are just drive-bys checking the park. It's not that dangerous, and this activating that end with both gates and the shelter in an active area would make it safer just through the increased usage there. And one stated issue was that people didn't know there was a shelter in the park. Secondly, the blind spots of having the bath entrances and the shelter entrances under that overhang, not visible from the street. Think now about the West End shelter. You're driving down Gorham and you see the beautiful, give me 15 more seconds. You see the beautiful structure at the end of the park and you'd have time to slow down and pull into the lot.
Would you please
then-
step down.
So please table the issue. I think you're
Thank you.
far too rigid in your chairmanship of this committee. When someone's passionate as tell them you
appreciate
don't give
your
them 3 minutes and
conversation.
15
Mr.
seconds.
Cleva?
No other
Mr.
meetings are
Cleva,
this
you
rigid.
are up next.
Someone came all the way here and is
Thank
not
you.
at home to put their girls to bed, and they came and they have 15 seconds more to say you're far too rigid.
What do you have to say?
I have to second Joe's opinion, but I am also privileged to live in James Madison Park, and I have two issues to address concerning the master plan. First is, what are your criteria for parking? Have you thought about that? Okay? The Parks Division has presented what they consider what they consider satisfies their criteria for parking. And what you're hearing from the community is very different. The community wants much less parking than what is currently proposed. Also, how does the parking affect impermeable surfaces so close to the lake? Okay, I really would appreciate the commission evaluating or keeping those factors in mind when you're thinking about parking. Also, along with parking, I will refer you back to UDC's comments about the master plan. And what they said was there should be no parking in the park. Landmarks. Some of the testimony at Landmarks involved appreciating the open space that's created by the demolition of all the historic buildings that ran from Butler Street to almost Livingston. Okay, there are only 4 buildings that remain in the park or 5 buildings that remain in the park after that demolition. So to put more pavement in the park was, according to the testimony, was disrespectful to the history of the park. The second issue I want to address is there needs to be an evaluation of the west shelter. And I think that the commission should undertake a process for weighing issues like the accessibility, the open space, septet design issues, parking, and all that comes with that. And it does not have to take an inordinate amount of time. It doesn't have to prevent the acceptance of the plan, but I think that it is worth the effort of evaluating the west shelter as a concept. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Terry Sandstrom of 3520 Graduate Street, to be followed by John Jacobs.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and thanks also, I know that staff's put a lot of time into this. I think I read the letters that you've received prior to coming here, and I think that it would be a really good idea to incorporate those emails that you've received as part of the public input process. I think that people have mentioned this, and I've actually looked in by doing an open records request with the Madison Police Department about some of those 700 calls, because that really got my attention before talking with anyone and just reading that master plan, because I have seen before projects get pushed through using sort of a kind of a scare tactic. I don't know how it ends up, how it happens, but it's wrong. And I don't know even if Parks was aware that some of these these numbers were basically park rangers coming in visiting park. It's not a police call. A lot of those 42 incidents, by the way, that were calls were things like stray dogs and things like this. So that aside, I wanted to mention that a good plan will generally be celebrated by people and embraced. It takes a lot to get me to show up at a meeting like this. And when I see the parking being put into the middle of that green space that I used to ride my bike past and look out towards the lake all the time, that made me very concerned. And I wanted to bring up one other big issue here, is that the actual physical safety would likely be compromised by any plan that relocates the parking lot along Gorham Street. Adding a parking lot entrance that crosses a busy bike lane on one of Madison's best coasting hills will inevitably lead to cyclists being injured or worse. The new hazard to cyclists is manifest when a driver sitting in traffic on Gorham decides to avoid the light or visit the park by crossing a bike lane into the new entrance on the uphill side end of the proposed parking. And this would apply to at least one and probably both of those new designs too, I believe. In the mornings, traffic can back up the hill, meaning that drivers executing such a turn may not always be aware of bikes that have coasted down the hill from behind as cars slowly approach the lot entrance. There's a lot of student turnover there, a lot of people that have just new to the neighborhood, and this is actually a very real concern. Anyhow, in any design process, it's difficult to obtain all the information required to optimal choices, even in the best of circumstances. And I think that, especially in a case like this, where there's a lot of complex trade-offs and public input, there's iterative design cycles may be required. I think I have not studied this design very much, but something like this, if this had been the original plan, I would have said, hey, neat, I can't wait to check it out, instead of being alarmed by what I saw. So I would encourage you guys to consider that. Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs, 2630 Kendall, to be followed by David Waugh of 704 East Corner.
Hi. While I've lived on the near west side for the last 43 years, I know and love James Madison Park. I used to row with Mendota rowing at the park, and when our kids were little, we'd come down to the park to hang out and be by the water. I, like thousands of Madisonians, get a little extra joy every time I simply drive by or bike past the park. I hope the board will reject all three plans the parks has given before you and send them back to the drawing board. I was vaguely aware of the planning process for the park, but until the Isthmus article, I had no idea there was a plan to diminish the best aspects of James Madison. If anything, I may have thought the folks in the neighborhood would take care of our parks. I've learned lately that they were trying. Since the Isthmus article, I've learned that people were working hard for months to save our iconic view across the park. I also learned that they were challenged about the awful parking plan along Gorham with the statement, well, not the statement, but the idea that it was non-negotiable since the very beginning of the planning process, probably before the beginning of the planning process. And why is that? The draft plan says that the design is contrary to recognized crime prevention through environmental design principles and may contribute to a high number of calls for service at the park. In about 11 months, 700 police calls for service to James Madison Park. I was one of the guys that did the public records. I asked parks for the data they used to justify the 700 police calls, compared that to what 911 came up with for every call that they got related to the park. It was 42, not 700. So we got the draft plan saying we got 700 calls, things are horrible, and it was 42. But I hate to say it, but our Parks Division non-negotiable agenda about the parking lot is being sold with the same kind of scare tactics and fear-mongering that Mr. Trump is using to describe folks who arrive at our southern border. Paint an exaggerated image of rampant criminality to build a wall, or in this case, move a parking lot. Besides the awful parking lot plan, the draft plan strikes me as confused, cluttered mess. It shouldn't be. The best part of James Madison is its simplicity. A wide expanse of grass and green from sidewalk to shore. For James Madison Park, it's certainly true that less is more. The draft plan reduces the green space that people can actually use by a large amount. Just look at the graphic that Parks gave to Isthmus, and it's somewhere in that computer. The shoreline is actually moved towards Gorham, which narrows the park. Making the park smaller is going to help more people. I don't get it. The overgrown science project called an emergent wetland and the adjacent plantings keep people away from 600 feet of shoreline. I'm all for science and education. I'm a lab manager at the UW. but this thing won't work and will instead be a maintenance nightmare for park staff. Perhaps part of this section should be built as seawall for fishing, and I will finish my sentence with a period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Waugh, 704.
Thank
East
you.
Flora.
East Gorham. Yep, I live on East Gorham Street. And, you know, one of the reasons that this was put on hold last time is that Alder Zellers had some questions. A big one I don't think was answered, which is how much are we increasing the non-permeable surface area that comes with this new parking and these plans? And I congratulate you all for voting in the big possible purchase that was before you earlier tonight of new park space. That's wonderful. I can tell you that James Madison Park needs every inch of green space. That really was what was top foremost in all of the public meetings. You really don't want to take away that green space. I've been in the neighborhood 25 years. Within the last 5 years, we've added almost 2,000 apartments. Imagine 4,000 people trying to fit in this room, and they're the park users. They're going to be going there. You cannot take green space away from this park. We have 100 units being built just a block away from this place. There's going to be more and more and more. This is a treasured green space for the exploding population in this area. Please, park staff have been wonderful to work with. I think that we need to continue the conversation about these issues. And living in the area, I can tell you that during the daytime, there's so much parking in the park, or on the streets, I should say. Like the other fellow said, why not just take some of those spaces and make them handicap spaces on the street? There's a lot of exploration that can happen to help us preserve the views, but more importantly, the green space. So thank you very much.
We can proceed in a couple of ways. I think we might want to hear from Sarah again, if people have questions. I would like to hear from the alder. And then I would like to hear from everybody on the commission. There was a distinct lack of conversation at the December meeting, and I think everybody is entitled to have opinions from this group as well. So, are you willing to speak?
Well, I will say a couple of things, but I think that there were some questions raised that were I on the commission. I am on the plan commission, and I know that I would be asking some questions about some of the things that were raised. I would say, and I think people have acknowledged that park staff did a tremendous job of outreach. And as with so many situations, people tend to hold off until the end, in a way, on some of the concerns that are expressed. So I think that some of what we're hearing we didn't hear early on. Some of it we started to hear as things went along, but I do think that there are some questions. A lot of people were talked to that are not represented here tonight, and I think that Sarah Lerner mentioned that. So they talked to some people, they talked to people from the Y, they did a lot of outreach trying to get to people where they are, in addition to the postcards that they sent out. I would like to hear Parks comment on the open space plan and the comp plan, and how that was considered in developing this. I would also like to hear, we heard Ms. O'Crawley's idea, and my understanding is that that was assessed to some extent by Parks and the consultant, so I think that it would be good to hear that. there are a lot of good things in the plan.
Sorry.
As with any change, there are pros and cons, and there are absolutely pros and cons in this. One of the things that I hear most about, not just on James Madison Park, but on almost any development or change, is about parking. Half the people think there's not enough, and half the people think there's too much. My preference would be, in general, to reduce parking, certainly in parks. That said, I do think that we have an equity issue here, and there was a RESG, the Racial Equity Social Justice assessment. This park is used by a great diversity of people, and one of my goals would be to maintain that diversity of use. And I fear that if we reduce the parking, that would not continue, because I think that I know that a lot of the people that use the park do drive to get there. Perhaps they could find parking on the street. Would they choose to come without more convenient parking? I fear that we would not have that kind of diversity. I've heard a lot of good comments about the stormwater and bioinfiltration. I really like seeing that, because I think that we need to do more to protect our lakes. So I want to see that kind of thing included. We heard a negative comment about the living shoreline, but we've heard lots of positive comments. So in terms of the maintenance of that, maybe parks could comment about that, because again, that was seen as a big positive. In terms of permeable, impermeable surfaces, very important, extremely important on a lakefront park. And as far as I'm concerned, throughout the city. I mean, we've got problems, as we know, with flooding. We've got problems with quality of our lakes. So permeable versus impermeable is very important. As is green space. One of the issues was accessibility. And my understanding is that the paths have not been necessarily accessible, and some of the increased surface, and I'm going to say surface, is because of trying to make things more accessible to folks who might have issues with mobility. So perhaps some comments from parks about that. What has led to what I understand to be an increase in some pavement. However, my understanding is that also is being made or planned to be permeable, whereas now the paved surfaces are impermeable. So, maybe some additional comments about that. So again, I do think that there are pros and cons on this. The other thing that I would like to know about, in addition to what has been done to look at that West Inn shelter, is if there would be a delay. I do believe that Parks has other things on their work plan for this year, and would that indeed be something that would be reasonable to expect more analysis and assessment. Thank you.
Sarah, can we hear from you? Perhaps we might start by,
Yeah.
and Ken.
Yeah, well, some of these
Yes.
people are pretty familiar with the project, might be able to better provide some answers for you.
So we've got two new options, and I'm, this is a,
Would you like to would that be helpful, or do you just want to ask some general questions?
I have questions for staff. That's what you mean.
I'm sorry?
I have questions for staff.
Well, good, but then you go ahead. That might help Sarah figure out where.
Yeah. So my first question is, according to the presentations, the card that you sent or the letter or the mailing you did to invite people to the meeting was not reflective of exactly what we were doing. Can you speak to the content of the card that you sent us?
So we send 8,000 postcards, which is what we typically do, identifying the public meeting dates. So for our postcards, they're like this big. We send a notice to people saying these are all the dates of the public meetings. So it doesn't include what the plan changes are. The letter to the community organizations that we sent out was the flyer showing those dates, and we had posted on the kiosks and posted in the park, and a letter kind of roughly going over the project. But it was at the very beginning of the process, informing everyone. So it didn't have the final results sent out. We didn't send out the final plan to anyone.
Was there anything that told them that what the meeting was about?
Yes.
You didn't just send a card and say we are meeting so and so.
Right, right, no, so
So,
they talked about the process, the project. There was a link to the website which had a lot more information. I think we included QR codes, which were also on the sign where people could just go straight to that website.
Were the notices about the master planning process or about shelter?
So also, can you speak to the shoreline improvement? Those are concerned that how does your plan address that?
Which improvement?
The shoreline?
Ken, do you want to speak to that one? It's the landscape architecture. Design?
So, we had heard that the existing shoreline was, particularly the seawall, was not providing enough diversity of both water and land.
Could you be provided a microphone so we got an audience came all the way over here to hear this?
Right. So the shoreline renovation was in response to providing better and more diverse habitat for both water-based and land-based animals and flora. So it also is a better use of the shoreline for public access and safety. So those were a number of the things that were considered when we looked at the shoreline renovation.
Can you also speak to the, like how much green space are we losing by moving the parking lot, either the whole parking lot or part of the parking lot? In the middle?
He's looking at me.
No, I'm looking at Tom, he's got the numbers.
So a lot of it,
You want to use the microphone, please?
It's horrible, I'm not going to get into specific numbers, but yes, there is portions of green space that will be converted along.
No, I want to know overall, are we losing green space or we are not losing green space?
So we are going to see a slight reduction in overall green space as a whole, but because of the way that we have organized the entirety of the park, we've tried to be intentional in making sure that there is more contiguous, flat, open green space, which is something that is really desired by the community. So we have, especially in these new plans, increased that by several thousand square feet. So,
and how much parking space is added to this plan?
how much is it? There is more square footage of parking space.
How many spaces?
How many spaces? We're keeping the same number of parking spaces on this plan that exists there today.
Okay, so it's neither increasing nor decreasing.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm interested in the bikes coasting down the hill, and wonder why you don't have more parking spaces in that Blount Street lot where you're at the crest of the hill and you don't have that issue and it's already public parking that is not well marked.
So the original parking relocation was in response to function and access in the park. So one of our goals was, and one of the things we heard in the public process was wanting to enhance the experiences of the park users, whether they be basketball players or families or people using the shelter. So the new shelter is an expanded version of what it's now. It's got a lot more amenity to it, and so the notion of organizing parking and major activities in the center of the park around the shelter was really one of the driving forces to why things were designed the way they were.
Ken, did you, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You through?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Did you consider putting more of the active area back, so, you know, to the west end, and you eliminated that intentionally?
So one of the things that we heard in the process was that there were oftentimes conflicts between activities at the basketball court and parking lot and at gates. Also, the notion of putting a major facility like a shelter near to Gates of Heaven is, I think it's going to play havoc with the operation of both of those facilities. So as you know, park shelter reservations are part of nowadays they're a lottery system, and if you want to have whatever, your wedding at a park shelter, you have to get in line and hope that your number is drawn. And so the planning for the shelter in most Madison parks is done way ahead of other activities. So one of the things that came to my mind when we were thinking about what happens if you have a shelter next to Gates of Heaven, you know, you could plan your wedding far in advance or plan your class reunion far in advance, but you may not be able to have, well, you don't have that kind of luxury when you're planning a funeral or some other activities. So it really becomes a scheduling problem where you have major activities right next to each other.
So you intentionally separate?
Right. We did look at moving Gates of Heaven as one of the alternatives. That didn't sort of come out as a winner. We did look at the idea of a satellite shelter or bathroom facility. That was rejected early on because of maintenance costs and operations. So we had looked at the west area as a potential, not for a major shelter, but as an enhanced facility. But again, some of these decisions that were made early on were to look at a centralized activity center.
So so when you guys had like the public input, that was one of the inputs to move, was that to move the basketball court to Central? Was that part of the public input?
I think correctly, the message coming out of the public input was to enhance the basketball court experience. And part of that was having a restroom facility near at hand to that. Having also, we heard that oftentimes basketball went with kids who would be at the playground, or basketball would go with picnicking. So the notion of sort of aggregating those more active activities in a central location was really one of the driving forces behind the plan.
So, how much of your design was influenced by public input?
I'd say that's the major driver in how the project came about, the design came to be what it is.
What I hear is, and what I hear from the neighbors seems to be a different end. It doesn't look like, except if that only one part of this community is represented here. What you presented to us and what they're talking about is they're totally different.
Well, again, I think one of the things that Sarah mentioned, and Zia, Mark, if you guys want to follow up on this, but one of the objectives of the ResG process was
to reach out to people who don't get to come to meetings like this and have reasons why they're not here tonight. And so I think as you look at the input that we received overall, I think the plan that we developed and the direction that it took was really based on that larger sampling of public input.
So you say, for example, moving the basketball court, for example, was influenced by that group of people?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
All right. I also have a question for some of the people who spoke.
All right.
The only person I know is Bob. Yes, and the other guy who wanted to speak more.
Joe.
You wanted to ask me a question?
Yes.
Alder Balder?
Yes. So it looks like from the presentation, these people read out to over 20,000 people. You guys are the immediate neighbors at this area. Me and you and others has had a meeting around this park. What happened to an extent that we have these different opinions? How many times did you participate, particularly you and them, in this process of redesigning the park?
That's a great question. There were 4 public meetings and 5 stakeholder meetings. Yes, and I was unable to attend one of the public meetings. So I attended all 8 of the 9. And I think that there were 20,000 points of contact, and I really appreciate Parks Division and the contractors making that very serious effort to get as much feedback as possible. But what's interesting is if you drill down and look at the 20,000 number, it really doesn't, you may actually be able to talk to these people, but the data you're getting comes from a much smaller sample. And forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but the feedback on where to place things was from a much smaller group of people, and I'd say that was fewer than 1,000 people involved in actually providing feedback on where the locations of different features of the park should be, and what people felt were important criteria for the design of the park. And certainly there were key players involved, like what are the accessibility people?
Access to independence.
Access to independence. There was some very excellent. There was very excellent feedback from that group on the design, and the contractors really worked hard to engage people of color and disadvantaged people. They reached out to Salvation Army, YWCA, and there were definitely there was definitely a broad spectrum in there. I'd say though that one of the problems was that, as Joe mentioned, that the shelter, we were focused on rehabilitating or reusing the shelter somehow. And the location of the shelter was fixed where it is now as a result in many of the iterations of the plan. And it wasn't until later on that we figured out that we had to start from scratch on the shelter because of zoning issues. And as a result, some of the issues got designed where they are through the length of the process. And we're dealing with the west side a little bit later. Did I answer your questions? I'm sorry.
To a certain degree, but I want you to come forward and say a little bit about what you wanted to say and how your opinion is so different from what we have out here.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Bob said. That to send out 20,000 postcards telling people that these are the list of the meetings is real different than getting approval of what we're seeing today.
That, what, how did you participate in the process?
Similar to Bob, I was on the stakeholders group, so I attended almost all the stakeholders meetings. I missed the first one. and most of the public meetings as well. So but there were so many bells and whistles to focus on. It wasn't clear through the early part of the process that the parking was for sure going to be along Gorham, and it didn't, as we were focused on a lot of shoreline things. And I never once heard anyone say move the basketball courts. I think, like Ken said, it was talk about improve the experience of basketball. They didn't say move them. I mean, there'd be another way to get a restroom near the basketball courts would be to put one there. It was unfortunate that the West End shelter was never considered seriously, and it wasn't explained to us why, and it's still not really explained to us why. And it solves nearly all the problems, as I stated before, and I think it allows people to see that there's a shelter, and you can drive down Guam and see it and pull into it. And I think with scheduling, you can, I didn't get the bit about funerals, but you can schedule, you can stagger the events, and people could have the synergy of a wedding. So many weddings in Gates Heaven with the shelter there. So I think the reason, to answer your question, why we're coming to a different conclusion now is people got the image. Fortunately, someone did an opinion piece in Isthmus that put the parking lot, front and center and jarred people. It's as it should. It's
that was my next question.
startling.
How is your opinion influenced by what you read from the newspapers as opposed to what your original opinion may have been?
My opinion? Well, I mean, I know the person who wrote that opinion article, and I was on the stakeholders meeting, so I knew everything all along. So I was appalled by the parking. It just, the message wasn't getting out, and people weren't seeing. People were thinking about a shelter redesign and all the pretty picture of the shelter and the parking. As you've heard plenty tonight, how the public experience of the lake. How many times do people even know that Lake Mendota is there? Along James Madison is one of the biggest places that people see in their daily commute, that there's a lake. And so that has got people citywide concerned about this. And whereas the year-long input process was a lot of minutia about what, do we want adult fitness equipment, and do we want a fishing pier, and there's a lot of odds and ends. But now I think we need to look at the bigger picture. And is there a way that we can come closer to meeting everybody's needs without ruining those views and that open space? So I think the public input was good, but a lot of it was generic and early on, and it was, we like the open space, or we want a better shelter, we don't like the silos, it was stuff like that. So I think we've come a long way, and there's a seed of something good here, but I think it's not. I would hope we wouldn't use the excuse of let's approve this now because we're kind of tired of this and we want to get it done. We've got other things to do. Let's spend another 3-4 months, whatever it takes, 2 months, whatever. City staff did a good job of coming up with some alternatives overnight on parking. Let's spend another month, 2, 3. Consider how we can not damage the beauty of the park and still meet folks' needs.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.
I have a question to Mr. Ty, having to do with a west shelter. It seems to me we're not wanting to put buildings close to the lake.
I think there's several concerns of where the current basketball courts are and/or the proposed west shelter. So this current plan does provide better access from Gilman Street. Right now, the way the basketball court is currently situated, there's a large hill that comes down. And so there's a large piece of land that cannot be used really by anybody because of that. And also the amount of space between the basketball court and the current lake sort of cuts off this area that provides sort of a no man's zone. I happen to have offices free from Foley and Lardner, so I look at the park all day long, every day, and it is used a lot, starting at 6:30 in the morning. Liddell, the Tai Chi guy, is then, yes. And Liddell goes down there, but there is a lot of inappropriate behavior that happens at that side of the park. I think the basketball courts, whether they're moved completely from their current location or moved to better for better park uses. I think the idea of moving the shelter from one side of the park to the other, I think there are positives and negatives to that. If you keep the shelter where it currently is, you then can have stuff going on at Gates in Heaven. You can have a wedding there, and then you can have a fundraiser or a rock band or something else at the shelter. You don't have conflicting, you have two venues. If you do combine them, you essentially can have better weddings, but you then can't have something else. I think that's, the Parks Commission to look at, do you want to have two venues or one? I think that's a good point, and I'm not going to make that decision. I do know there'll be a lengthy process, and I don't know if the city attorney has provided advice on this, but as you know, building a building in the St. Madison Park might or might not trigger a city referendum. So that's something that I think you might want to have some clarity on about what the process would be to implement the master plan. But I do think, as Liddell said, there were a lot of things that people had enormous agreement on. They want more swimming. They want a better shoreline. They want lots of open space. And I think that's going to be getting into the details of, do we have more open space or not? Do we want two programmable spaces, or do we want one? Do we want two basketball courts, or do we want one basketball court? Do we want more parking stalls or less parking stalls? These are all very serious questions. I do think the plan has lots of positive things, but from the Clean Lakes Alliance standpoint, we would like to see a reduction in services, whether they're permeable or impermeable. I think it's the duty to the city to lead by example. If we are going to want all of our citizens to have rain gardens one day and rain barrels, the city should lead by example and reduce its footprint in the park. And you might want to go back and look at that. And also for it to withhold all the water that lands on the park. There's lots of different modeling. The park should have a zero runoff into the lake. And also has a responsibility, because of the outfalls of everything in the downtown, goes directly into the lake right now through the park. So there's a lot of things in this that's very positive. The devil's in the detail, which is also what I don't think you're approving today. I think you're approving it today, the parking lot is built, no matter where it's built or not built, the detail plan, I presume, comes back at a later date. The interpretive wetland will come back to you one day with what that will look like. There's been an extensive process. I think it's one of the most beloved parks in the city. It's personal meaning to myself, but again, I think there's some nuances that probably need to be cleared up to get some more community buy-in for the process, and maybe some clarification. But again, we just had a flood, and the city should lead by example and set the hallmark for the most sustainable, accessible park in the city.
I'd be interested in the commission's comments on the two options that have been presented, the maps that we're looking at. We're looking at the staff's response to comments about parking, which was the primary issue that came up in December.
I guess my biggest thing about parking, I kind of think we should go to the extreme and not have parking, because I'm with open green space too, because I don't know. It just seems like that's one of the biggest issues. It is, but it's kind of inconvenient because I don't live in this neighborhood, and I do like going to this park. And if it's no parking, where am I going to go? It's not a lot of, options. I really like coming, but I don't go to this park that often because it's really not, like, I had to drive on that street. It's just kind of like, I don't really want to be over there, but it's really nice. But I think the biggest issue would be if we had good transportation, it probably would be great. If I had a nice bus that I could get on and I had an open green space, where then we wouldn't even have these conversations because we actually had transportation to get to the park. But now it's like, well, we don't really have good transportation, so we need parking. So that's like my thought about the whole thing. And I'm kind of, I don't know why the basketball court got to be moved to the center. It just sounds like everybody really don't want it there. So that's my perspective about it all.
Moira, do you have some thoughts?
Specifically about the parking, yeah, it's a tough choice, right? I feel bad the trees would have to be removed. I would love to see no parking. I would love to see us be a society that doesn't rely on cars, but we do. This is a big park for the community and people drive to it. So I think we need some parking. I'm happy to see that we're not increasing the spaces at all. It's the same amount. I had a question, and I'm not sure who in this room can answer it, but about the police calls, because we've heard very different things about the police calls. So that part, I don't know if anybody can speak to that.
Who can speak to that?
Well, Sarah, somebody can. I mean, I do want to start with it for Moira. You weren't here, but for everybody in the crowd, this commission's not going to be trumped. Is that what it was? It's going to trump you by misleading data with safety of the park. This commission opposed unanimously last year in this building, at the end of last year, before Moira joined, the installation of a security camera that was supported by the neighborhood, my understanding, in James Madison Park. The Parks Commission has a strong stance on that matter, and at the time had Captain Friedman before it. I don't want to speak for the captain. I don't want to get too far into the weeds about the details of the police calls, but this park is not designed around police calls. We don't ever design around police calls. Certainly the data and how things are recorded or not, we can go down that road, but this commission is not going to be bullied by a misled number. It wasn't early in the process. It's never been a core component of the design. And certainly this commission knows and has heard from Captain Friedman, the Central District Captain, I think it was in December of 16 actually, maybe when he was here in the atrium, in detail about the concerns Madison Police does have and has had about James Madison. And this commission still chose at that time. We as staff supported them that they did not see the value in adding cameras to the parking lot and the park property. So I just want to put that out there. It's never been addressed. Maybe it's my role to kind of bring that around to folks that this commission and staff in total do not see James Madison as a crime-infested park. But septet is a thing, and when you do design, you do look at ways to prevent negative issues in that design. I'll let, I think, Sarah and probably maybe who else, I don't know, but Sarah definitely has more of the 700 calls or number of calls. I can tell you that Rangers get called there a lot, Reynolds a lot, way more than Bordner in my neighborhood or Garner in my neighborhood. It's a little anecdotal. We'd have to go and dig into Ranger details, but just on the police and major calls issues, it is not a crime-infested park, and I would argue that no one should make primary decisions about the critically important balancing act of how to allocate public space in a public park on the lakefront based on anything related to crime data. Right? It's not going to be a good baseline for any of us to make. That should not be the driver. If it's a consideration over there, that's fine, but I would make the driver, I would be clear that anything me or my staff has done makes it feel like that is our driver. That is not the case, and it shouldn't be.
And it was just something that I heard a lot about.
But Sarah can kind of walk through maybe how things get confused a little bit more, but.
Yeah, I think.
Can you stand up again?
Microphone. Sorry, I should use one too. Not loud.
Yeah, I think that, it's unfortunate that kind of got pulled out of the narrative as the leading cause for the design. And I want to be very clear that it's not. And that data is really very broad calls for service. It can mean a lot of things, and I don't know all the details of what it means. I have to talk to all the officers. So, you know, it's probably indicates more that there's vigilance and concern in the community, but I don't want it to misconstrue as anything that was used design around. We've heard about public safety issues. You know, you guys heard from Mendota Rowing, they had issues, and James Ty has mentioned it about workers that work at barracks and their concerns. So we heard it as a safety issue, but we would not design a park based on police data.
If I could just amplify on that, the design. And then maybe you can find that slide.
Oh, yeah.
So again, the design of the, especially in the concept stage, was about enhancing the user's experience in different ways. And this part of Sarah's presentation shows the alternatives that were presented at the third public meeting. You can see, and the green dots are good, and you can see all the green dots that are on the parking areas. So we had proposed this idea. We had gotten very positive feedback at the public meeting, and subsequent to that, we heard from police departments saying, oh, this is great, this will make our job a little bit easier. So while it, and we've talked about SEPTEC principles and how they're applied to this plan, but again, the primary driver for the plan was enhancing the user's experience.
Yeah, so to that end, I mean, to get a little bit more into what you were asking, Madeline, I'm somebody who does like the concept of what you've done is moving the basketball courts and the playground area together. I know last month we heard from people saying, you know, a family goes and it would be nice to have that experience. My kids are much older now, but I remember many times going to parks, and I have one kid on a soccer field over here and I have a kid way over here that wants to go on the playground, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's where you need to put parking. I appreciate the neighbors' tremendous hard work on this concept of moving things westward. At the same time, I think it makes sense to have these two sort of venue activities in the park. So to me, a lot of this makes sense. And then, of course, the living shorelines. I really like that notion where you're using some natural processes, and that's a better way to deal with erosion and flood control in Wisconsin. And I like the bioretention area. There's a lot of things I like about this. I just want to, also as other people, I'll take this opportunity, as long as I have the floor, to thank the city staff, thank our chair for how she's heard a lot of viewpoints tonight, and thank everybody for coming out. This is a really emotional and important part to all of us, and I've appreciated the chance to have a really good conversation. I've appreciated all the emails that have been coming for the last couple months. I read every single one. So it's been a good process.
Nancy?
Well, I looked at it and I just asked earlier about why we couldn't move some things further west.
Can you speak up maybe a
Yeah.
little bit?
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's on or not.
It's on?
Yes.
Okay. But I think it's part of the imperfect world. There isn't a perfect plan to satisfy everybody. And I've looked at it all week long. And yes, I've also read letters. Lauren spoke very well. And ideally, if you could move the basketball courts further west and the active court, it would be a little bit better. But I hear Ken's argument that, you know, the activities going on at Gates of Heaven don't go with basketball playing and volleyball. So it's imperfect, but it's a good plan. I know Sarah and crew has worked long and hard on it too. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think generally we're being asked for feedback on parking. And I have some general, it seems to me that pervious parking lot surface is better than what's there today, is impervious parking lot space. So if you're adding a few feet of pervious parking lot space and getting rid of old asphalt that's right next to the lake, that might be a net gain. I think that where the basketball court is put is an attempt to create uninterrupted green space, which again I think is better than separated square footage of green space that might have less flexibility in how people would use it. And then finally, maybe in a perfect world we have perfect public transportation. But we live in a world where we don't have that. And we also live in a world where people who don't get around as well as they would like, or as all of us would like, might experience barriers because of that. And I think that's what the parking is intended to do. I think that, you know, the first speaker when we spoke last time was from the Access to Independence group and was very appreciative of the work that Steph and your team has done to think about what their barriers to use of James Madison Park are, because they're citizens too, and they should also have the chance to use the park the same way that someone who wants to go play flag football or anything else that someone might want to do in a park. And so there is a net cost to wild natural green space in order to provide that access, but we're a densely populated urban area, and so we willingly make that trade-off because we want to make these parks accessible to people. So that's what I think about the designs. I candidly struggle to quite understand between option 1 and option 2 that are shared here. I think option 1 has more spaces in the middle and fewer spaces by Blunt Street, but it's like 2. Is that fair?
14 to 8 is the middle goes from 14 to 8, so option 1 is 14.
And those 6 spots go and sort of blow out the parking lot on Blunt Street?
And gates, they're split.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, thank you.
So I think basically I would get started by saying thank you for reaching out to so many people. I mean, 20,000 you said? There's a lot of people to reach out to. It is very difficult in this city, obviously, to get some people out. My only concern here is the difference in opinion and how that came about. So my question to you, maybe the final question, is that how do you all feel about some of the ideas that came about during this meeting, to an extent that is there any need for you to look at this again and come back?
So I think your first question, restate your first question, and I get to, my bedtime's like at 9,
So I'm just saying generally that we've had a lot of opinions of people suggesting different stuff. How do we make the park better? I think the intention of this whole thing is to make sure that everybody who lives in the city enjoy that space and see it as their own somehow. Now, from what we had tonight, is that good enough for you to say, okay, look, let's look at some of the things that they say, and maybe come back with 1 or 2 additions, or look, I think this is as a result of what we've had, and I think this is the best we can do with the space for everybody.
You know, I think there are some, like I think a lot of people have been saying that there's no perfect solution. I think that the plan we have respects a lot of voices. It also has, you know, issues that the neighbors have brought up. I see the West End shelter idea as also having similar pros and cons. You know, it's nice how the parking lot was designed, but I foresee that it would likely not address some of the other issues. So like this plan, it's probably going to be similar in that it's going to have its issues that work and that don't work. I don't think it'll address perhaps a lot of the comments about paving and street removals, but I don't really know because, you know, it's a sketch and a lot of it hasn't been developed. So I'm not sure that it's actually going to provide the miracle plan that would really kind of fix everything. Does that provide any help?
Yeah, so generally my question is that, is there something that you want to think about or not? So if you don't want to think about anything now, then we'll vote on it. If you want to think about something, then we will find a way maybe to say, okay, come back with your thoughts and things. That's my question. But I don't know.
Can I speak before she answers that?
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody on the commission. People have worked hard, like Nancy. I mean, we've all spent a lot of time on this. And everybody who's here also. I like driving over the hill on East Gorham, and I like looking out over the park. So I've been uncomfortable about the parking on East Gorham. I'm also persuaded that the primary issue we've heard about is improving amenities in the park. And I'm persuaded that centralizing the amenities is a smart thing, as Moira says. I think I would be happy, on balance, with option 2, which gets rid of the historic house that might have gone in favor of parking. And then to have those limited stalls by the basketball court. It seems to me that you've accomplished a lot by breaking up the parking. You've preserved the view as you come over East Gorham. You have used space between the houses in an efficient way. There was a gentleman who spoke here last month about something like double-loaded parking lots or something as being efficient, and that's what you've got with those 12 stalls. I don't think this meeting was intended to vote on a final recommendation. It was key that staff have some input, which they didn't get at all last month. So I guess I'm just saying, here's some input, and if you can do any better with the parking on East Gorham, I would be thrilled. But the West Shelter strikes me as another building close to the lake, and I don't know anything about the referendum issue, but I think we've got a lot to work with here. And there is also, I believe Sarah said early on, possibility of continuing to look at street parking.
Yes, I think we would continue to look at that prior to any implementation of street parking.
So in light of those things, I guess, I would now like to hear Sarah say.
No, so
do you have something?
You don't have to answer the question, I guess, but on the thing, it did say with possible recommendation. That's what it says on the agenda.
It
So
says a possible recommendation.
Yeah.
But clearly input was important, and I think.
Yeah.
I think we received that.
Have you received input?
Well, I guess I will, yeah. I should, because I want to take credit and blame where credit and blame is due on my chair and not anyone else's. I don't recall it being the Weston shelter or not, but certainly what you saw presented tonight presents a new building in the park. And obviously I respect and appreciate neighbors and people who like a specific park. like new amenities and adding on things. This park, though there is no budget set for it, part of my responsibility is to try to deliver that master plan eventually and build a budget that's doable. Adding additional structures doesn't strike me as particularly green or sustainable over the long term or stormwater focused. No matter what you do with them, they're another building in a park that has 7, if I can count. I might not be able to. That's a concern, but also the budgetary concerns and resources of getting this done. Part of what we should do with the master plan, and I think our plan contemplates it, when the long-range planning subcommittee spent months and months talking about master plan process, one of the things that I remember hearing when I came and visited with Ed and Steve is they wanted to see master plans that we could effectively build, right? And I certainly have a concern with the plan, any of the plans we have. I mean, these are expensive plans. So when we talk about a referendum, I would tell you, as I've told staff and Sarah from the beginning, don't worry about the referendum language because that shouldn't be what dictates a plan. A, the city has exempted itself from that direct democracy action many times already. It is the only direct democracy action I'm aware of that's in the city ordinance, and it's a horrible ordinance, and I hope I'm quoted in the paper about that. It's just kind of bad. It's just not a good ordinance for a lot of reasons, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about why that's confusing, and I get the intent, it's just not very well done. But certainly, the budgetary resources at some point do become a thing. And so from my chair, you're looking here, what's been presented with a lot of input, how many, all those type of things. You're looking at a project that is south of $20 million. My hope is it's south of $15 million. I'm probably getting optimistic, can't go right away. But I think it's in that ballpark. Every time you add a new building and a new location, right, you're adding more money. And anytime there's a new building, like in a brand new location where no building currently exists, and when you're adding additional buildings off the base, you can definitely count on in this park with the urban design district, you can count on $1 million a building at the floor. I can't build a restroom building anywhere for less than 400. There's no way I'm building in an urban design district in a historic landmark park with 5 landmarks in it already. Am I going to build a $400,000 shelter, right? So just so you guys know, it's not that you should drive your decision, but as far as one of the reasons we did not look at adding facilities is that shoreline's going to be expensive, and that's my #1 priority. It has been from the beginning. We've got to do something about the water. It is a problem. Doesn't have to be your priority, but definitely ours, and that's going to be very, very expensive. Rebuilding a shelter, even in its current space, is going to be very, very expensive. Building parking, and I do not like parking because it's very, very expensive. The good news is Gates of Heaven with the $500,000 project that's been ongoing for a few years now, continuing into the next year, it won't be as expensive, but a mindset to put that I can't help you to think about is somebody has to say, this is getting too expensive, and this is darn close, and you'll take it to the point where it'll never be built. And that's not me saying that, it's knowing the process and how it works. If you add too many things, it'll be a master plan that can't get funded because it's too much of a pipe dream. And master plans are balancing acts. I respect the commission's decision, however it wants to go about it next month and take a final vote. But we took a pretty good kick at it. The neighbors and the criticism, I welcome it, I really do. John Stuart Mill said some really smart stuff about criticism and on liberty, and I think we all should read that, chapter 2. It makes us better and stronger, and I really do appreciate it. And I think it's important. It'll make a better plan in the end. So that's my thoughts. It's late, but I just don't want you guys to accidentally try to vote on it, because I really think it's best that we don't vote, because we'd like to design something a little more formal than that.
Madam Chair,
But,
could I just make one comment too? May I?
Yes, please.
I wanted.
Microphone.
I just want to reiterate my thanks for the people who really care about parks. And while we might not end up in the place that everybody would like us to be because people have differing opinions, the fact that people care, that they're willing to spend time, that they're willing to come out, I really appreciate that, because that's what makes for a better city, better parks. And I think by having that engagement, we end up with better plans and in a better place. So my thanks to everybody who has come out and spent time on this. I do really appreciate it. And I appreciate the work of this commission. As I mentioned, I'm on the Plan Commission, and I know that the decisions can be very difficult because there are pros and cons. So thank you for the work that you do and for the dedication and consideration of various viewpoints. So thank you.
All right, I think we're going to conclude this item on this agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn? Yes, second? I'm second. Is everyone ready to? I'm sorry.
No, I was just asking you to make a recommendation.
If you wish to, please don't adopt the whole plan. That's it. No, I just want to say that I think, obviously it's a very good discourse. So it's all part about what is said. And so the fact that we don't want to stop adopt anything or recommend anything, I believe that we look at what is said and see how we can make a plan. So thank you for the work and for the help.
Yeah, we did. All right, all in favor of adjournment? Aye. Thank you.